Hey everyone, thanks for joining. Today I'm speaking with Grace. Started following Grace. I saw her on Twitter, and she'd done a thread about how, call it whatever you want, woke, critical social justice was encroaching in her business, and how she pushed back against it. And it was a really good thread. Anyways, Grace, thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, if you wouldn't mind going through like what had happened with your business, and I correct me if I'm wrong, like it was your business, right?
A nonprofit organization. Yeah, I'm one
Okay.
of one of the co-founders.
Okay. So yeah, if you wouldn't mind like letting people know what had happened and like how it all just came about.
Right. So it was over the course of several years, really. I condensed a lot of history down into a short thread, as we have to kind of do for
Yeah.
Twitter. But yeah, it was, I think, how many people have experienced just intuiting that there was this other way of knowing that was being expressed in certain rhetoric and kind of a attitude that was showing up at our workplace. And it took a while actually to even figure out what it was. And I heard you kind of grappling with the language there, like what even is this thing that we're describing? And I think that that's um, a real, I wouldn't say problem, but it is a factor in figuring out how to address the thing, is even being able to name what it is. But essentially, yes, it is critical social justice and this idea that a person can gain a critical consciousness that enables them to see systems of power and oppression and these structures that are built within these systems of power and oppression that are oppressing certain people and benefiting other people based on identity categories. But I mean, at first, when the it was just rhetoric that we were hearing, and these attitudes that were at varying degrees of aggression, we wouldn't have been able to verbalize any of that. It just was the sense that, oh, like there's a lot of passion around, justice, and that's good. And we like justice too. And that's why we started our nonprofit organization. But just being unfamiliar with some of the language and had to start digging into the claims that were being made, and that kind of led me into the journey that I described in my Twitter thread of understanding that there was sort of a whole philosophical structure underneath these ideas that the proponents of some of these ideas themselves weren't even necessarily aware of entirely, and yet it was motivating their approach to solving problems of injustice in the world.
Just one question. Like you said you started noticing this over a period of time. Like rough, like ballpark around when did you start seeing a shift of when people were talking about social justice, it wasn't quite what you thought about, or like just any term like like racism went from being don't be prejudiced based on race to prejudice plus power. Like so when did you
Yeah.
start, like roughly around what time did you start noticing those shifts?
Um, well, I live in a very socially and politically progressive part of the world in the Pacific Northwest. So honestly, this language and this I was familiar with the language, not familiar with the ideas behind the language for, I don't know, many years now at this point. But within our organization, the motivation of our individual team members to sort of transform the way we thought about our work at the organization, that began, I would say, probably about 4 years ago or so. Um, and we were forced into examining the ideas closely, because what was being asked of us was to fundamentally change sort of how we go about doing our work and the way we thought about doing the work of trauma care, which is what our organization does. So we had to begin really addressing these claims that were being made.
Okay, so if you can just get into a little bit of what was, like, because you mentioned trauma care, so I mean that's one of the things I've noticed, and I've spoken to a couple of people about this, and it's the way trauma is being used is being changed.
Yep.
And I mean, I've used this example for myself, and okay, like I preface this by like, I'm not claiming any kind of PTSD or trauma or anything here, but it's just like a very mild example of this. Okay. Like it's, so I worked in war zones, and, every couple of months, every few months, we'd get a refresher on mine awareness training. So where to walk, where not to walk, what to look out for, be alert. And then when I was in Afghanistan, a lot of it was also IEDs. So keep an eye out for anything that's out of the ordinary. There could be roadside bombs. So you're always on alert. And every time you left the base, you got a little refresher on that to make sure you was stuck in your head. So for the first 6 months after I left Afghanistan, so like all in all, over a 10-year period, I was there 7 years about. So like the last time I left there, I came back home, and that was the last time I worked overseas. For roughly about 6 months, I wouldn't walk on anything except for like asphalt or cement or concrete. Like I wouldn't walk.
Yeah.
Like it just wouldn't. And it took me probably about a year to stop feeling uncomfortable about it. So like I said, I'm not claiming trauma or anything like that, but the way I see trauma being used, it's, you know, they're, they're overusing this term, and it's actually like, there is valid trauma. There is,
Yes.
there's a lot of serious stuff with it.
Hmm.
And to me, it just seems like it's being dropped, used at the drop of a hat. And
Hmm.
the way they're changing what harm is. And
Hmm.
it's so
Right.
like if you wouldn't mind talking a bit about that, and like you were talking
Sure.
about an underlying philosophy. So if you can get back into that, like how that
Mhm.
worked.
Right. So I think where I began to discern the shift was away from the individual and towards the collective in
Mm-hmm.
terms of how we think about trauma. So you're absolutely right. There is real trauma. Um, and there is a sense in which we need to take care when engaging with people who have experienced real trauma, and be careful not to re-traumatize or to be insensitive to the traumas that people have experienced. But what's happening, and what I began to understand, was that emphasizing the individual's experience of trauma was seen as inappropriate almost, in that group identities, there's real trauma connected to a person's social location, that even if they wouldn't say that that group identity adds to their trauma, they don't even really get to say that. Like there is this sense that, a person who, let's say a woman, doesn't see herself as a victim of trauma, or a victim of oppression as a result of men, is just blinding herself to the fact that no, actually she is just unaware of how she is oppressed by the patriarchal structures of society or whatever. So then the same could be applied to, a non-white person. If they don't see themselves as suffering from oppression as a result of whiteness in the world, is that that person just doesn't understand their oppression. And so it sort of removes the locus of control from the individual, and it says, no, actually, there are these oppressive structures, and it doesn't really matter whether you recognize them or not, they are oppressive. Whereas traditionally, in trauma work, there's a heavy emphasis on the individual's experience of trauma, because two people can experience a traumatic event in vastly different ways, and how that will impact them going forward. So, if you and I were both in a car accident and it was a terrible accident, but for whatever reasons, for your resiliencies that you have from your relationships, from your faith, from your values, all of that, if you're able to get up from that accident and sort of brush off the dust and walk away and be like, "Ooh, that was rough, but I'm going to be fine." And I might walk away from that accident paralyzed for the rest of my life with fear and unable to ever get in a car again. And we experienced the same event, but it was the meaning that we made of that event that was our trauma going forward. And so that individual experience is what's so important to address, and to take into account. But this idea that, historical traumas, which are real, there are traumas that have affected groups of people based on their identities, but that now we need to see that whether or not people recognize that they are a part of a group that has been historically oppressed or traumatized in different ways, that is a central part of their identity in the world. And the people who aren't owning that are in denial, in a sense. Um, and so we didn't like that at all. We thought that was antithetical to a strengths based approach to trauma, which says, hey, yeah, like all of us have, if you go back in history, um, our ancestors have experienced things. Our, group identities in different ways connect us to different kinds of discrimination or trauma. But people are very strong and resilient, and people people are able to move forward in different ways. And so we want to really honor the individual and their experience of trauma. And then it was told to us that a hyper focus on the individual, or even just a focus on the individual, was a white way of thinking. So again, it's like everything becomes this, and you've seen the PowerPoint slides now and all these trainings where it's like individuality is white supremacy. It's just like, wow, okay. So there's no defending now. Like now we couldn't defend our position that, actually it's really important for us to keep the individual at the center of how we think about how trauma affects individuals. And that was like, okay, you're erasing group identities and you're erasing historical traumas. And we're like, no, we're not. We're just recognizing that people make meaning of those things in different ways.
Okay, just something you talked about, the critical consciousness. Now, I've used this comparison with it, and I'm just going to bring it up. Like, I know John McWhorter is writing his book about this, and then James Lindsay's written a few articles about how it's religion. It was like one of the first things I noticed when I got back. I'm like, I was just like, the first thing I was like, we have blasphemy laws again. Like, what's going on? Like, there's something weird going on here.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I looked at the critical consciousness, like when I started reading this stuff, and I just started like finally getting into it, and I'm like, okay, that reminded me of like a bizarro Ezekiel. So like this like Ezekiel pulls back the veil and sees paradise, and
Mm-hmm.
so he's seeing heaven and he's seeing something good, right? That's what's behind the world. I mean, like these people are seeing oppression,
Mm-hmm.
and I mean okay. Look, I'm an atheist, whatever, like I'm probably like as devout an atheist as you're gonna find, but like I mean, for whatever I my gripes are with faith, but like you know, it offered you something good.
Mm-hmm.
It offers you a reward, and like I don't want to get into the whole argument about that because like I even with that like, but there is something there. You
Yeah.
know,
No, I
you,
think that's a really important point because I think we take for granted in the West that the underlying structure undergirding a lot of people's presuppositions about meaning in life and in the world are a Judeo-Christian framework, and that has provided um, a lot of good to society. It doesn't mean that you have to ascribe to those religions to understand the good and the meaning that provides. But yes, this theory that says, it's confirmation bias. If you start with a theory that says there's racism inherent in every interaction and every structure, then yeah, you're going to find racism because your theory already says it's there. It's not asking, it's not an honest inquiry anymore about is it there. It's saying it's there. And so it's like the seek and you shall find. They're going to find it everywhere. And same goes for the other theories that are all stemming from critical theory, like queer theory says that there's queerness everywhere, and there whatever, it's like they're going to find it everywhere. So they're interpreting. Speaking of James Lindsay, I saw something you posted yesterday about this conference around queerness in Tolkien's works, or the Lord of the Rings, and there were
yeah, I saw.
all these papers about Saruman being queer or whatever. It's just like, okay, like that is this. Of course you're going to find whatever you've already decided is there. So yeah, if your worldview, I am a Christian, so like I'm really grateful for how Christianity is so centered around the dignity of every single human being, and the uniqueness of every single human being, and that there is meaning in the universe and there is moral meaning in the universe. And so I see those things everywhere. And like, how does that make me interact with other people? And how does that make me pursue doing justice in the world? It's a very different framework than saying, like you said, peeling back the curtain and seeing that everyone is a racist is like, that's so cynical. And how's that going to make you treat people? If you frame white people as having parasitic whiteness, it's like, how's that going to make you treat white people? And how's that going to make you treat non-white people? It's like,
Yeah.
it's a problem.
Okay. Sorry, I always go off on these little tangents, but so like getting back to your nonprofit. So once I started seeing this stuff, and it took me like whatever, I'm working, like going through life. It took me a couple years to figure out, like even hear about critical race theory. But once I started hearing about it, I just started reading. So like, how long, like, had you been aware of any of this stuff before and had just not paid attention, or did something click and then you went and started looking into this?
Yeah. As I kind of alluded to, I was aware of this. I didn't have language for it, and I think that's where a lot of people are at still, or are on a journey of like kind of being able to put language to what they see happening. Living again, in the Pacific Northwest, I was around a lot of woke language and signaling, but hadn't really tried to dig deep in reading about the ideas underneath these behaviors and language. Yeah, until probably about 3 or 4 years ago, because of the heat within our organization around we need to be, um, investigating systems of power and oppression within this organization and transforming our organizational structures and our work around critical consciousness and the understanding that there is oppression inherent in every interaction, essentially. So because there was a real push to fundamentally transform our organization, I was forced to start reading, and I think it was intersectionality was a way in which a lot of these conversations were framed, was around this idea of intersectionality. So that's where I started. But in reading the intersectionality literature, it led me straight to the root of that, which was critical theory. And it was a long, it sounds, when you put it in a Twitter thread and you were looking back on it, it sounds so neat and tidy of like, well, they were saying things, then I looked into it and I figured it out and I did something about it. But it was like, it was a long, messy process of just trying to understand. I really wanted to understand. These were my friends. These were people that I had known for years who I respected and still respect. But when people are telling you I'm being harmed and you're harming other people, like, I would hope most people would take that seriously and not just say you're crazy or whatever, because it's like, if I'm really harming someone, I want to know. And when you're not familiar with how that accusation of harm or where it's coming from, you do take it seriously. And I think that that's where a lot of organizations and companies end up going into just appeasing these demands, is that there really is just a sincere intention to not do harm. But they don't understand that the definitions of safety and harm have been rewritten.
Okay, just like, so you said you saw this about, I guess, around like 2016 or so, like 4 or 5 years ago, roughly. So was that from? So I'm assuming if you're dealing with trauma and stuff, you have counselors and therapists and that kind of thing working, social workers or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. So was that from new people coming in, or were some of the older people, like some of the people who'd been there for a little bit, were they starting to adopt new ways of doing things? Uh, okay, I'll frame this in a. I worked up north, so I worked in an Inuit community, and most people who go there at the start of their career or the end of their career, they're never there like in the middle of their career. It's usually people who are just out of college, get a few years experience in a remote community. You're doing, so there's all kinds of stuff for social workers, childcare workers, healthcare, and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's people who go there to retire. So all the younger people that were coming up, everything I saw was everything was framed around victimization. And up
Mm-hmm.
north, it was more of a post-colonial lens than it was anything else. But
Mm-hmm.
and obviously like Inuit, colonies, and like you had missionaries and all that up there. So it was, but
Mm-hmm.
everything was framed through the lens of victimhood. And I'm like, I mean, like this isn't good for people. I mean,
Right.
first of all, you can't live up, in northern Canada where it's frozen basically 10 months of the year. I mean, there's permafrost, you know, even in the summer, you can only dig about a yard down, then there's permafrost. I mean, it's
Hmm.
like, it, you can't live up there unless you're resilient and tough and hardy. And
Hmm.
it's, you know, so when people who are supposed to be giving therapy or counseling are going in this way, like, I'm just curious, if it was people coming out of, schools, or if it was like, or if it was a mix, like, how did that work?
I think it was a combination. It was licensed mental health care professionals who had graduated from institutions that were influenced by critical theory. Um, and it was new people coming in, you know, at more entry level positions, say, doing administrative stuff for the organization who were, just very woke. And so then their demands, young people in their early 20s or whatever, their more, kind of confident assertions and things in staff meetings were then influencing these professional staff members to be more willing to instigate some of the changes that were being demanded. So it was kind of a combination. It was that the mental health professionals themselves were influenced by critical theory, and then you had some people that were maybe more what you would call agitators or instigators who were perhaps less professional in their in their approach. But it was already there. I would say that the clinical people on the team were definitely influenced by that frame, that way of looking at things. And it was just, I don't know, it's just picked up a lot of steam in the past years in terms of how I think people have felt emboldened to claim, as you mentioned religious before. It's like none of these assertions are really measurable or falsifiable. They're ipso facto sort of arguments, but the fact has never been established. It's like, well, we already know that whiteness is oppressive, so now we need to do something about it. I'm like, whoa, 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 back up. Like, when did you determine, and how would you prove that claim? And I don't know, it just seemed like at some point there was a tipping point where they felt very confident to say that their worldview was correct, and that anyone who doesn't act within that frame is asleep, or just unaware, and needs to be educated, and they're perpetrating harm by not actively seeking to dismantle these systems of power and oppression. So that at some point we got to that point where they just felt they felt confident enough to lay that accusation at our feet.
The way you'd mentioned something earlier where, they said, okay, you have to look internally, and your organization had to fix itself before it could fix others. Now, here's my biggest beef with all this stuff. And so, like, I don't know if this was correct, or like, like, this is the way I see it. It's, yes, it's an attack on civil rights. It's an attack on all that stuff. Like, I'm not discounting that. But my biggest problem with this is it's the biggest impediment to solving real issues. Like, yes, there's a problem with racism. Yes, there's a problem with, whatever, climate. But you're not going to
Mm-hmm.
fix climate if you start worrying about, I don't want to follow Greta anymore because I want to have activists of color. Like, okay, like, you don't need that, right? Like fix the goddamn problem. So the internal fixing, like, everything is racist, but we can't help anyone else until we solve the problems internally. Because if you haven't been doing it right through all along, it must be because there's racism inside, right? So, like, that's where I'm still not. I don't get how people who've, either you've done degrees in psychology, or you've got, stuff in counseling or social work, whatever. Like, people who've, I understand if you've gone through like a complete woke education all the way through, like, that's one thing. But these people who come in from, like, like you said, like administrative stuff and office managers and HR and, like, like those kind of, like, people who like meetings, like, if they start saying stuff that's patently false.
Hmm.
Like, why doesn't someone just come up? Because I mean, like, it's a huge statement to make that, like, I'm not saying that I don't know if they said that or not in your organization. Like, like we are a racist organization, blah blah blah. Like, I mean, like so many examples of that coming out. Like, like like from knitting circles all the way up to like university campuses, right?
Right.
So it's like, but you know, especially when if you got, like I said, therapists and counselors, like people who are trained to deal with this kind of stuff, like, wouldn't they just say, hold on a second, like, where are you getting this from? Like that, like,
Well, you would hope, but they have believed the assertion that all knowledge is socially constructed. Like I really do think it was partly the education that these professionals received that undermined their ability to continue to work in a way that is commensurate with the traditional approach to science, because they have truly believed that all knowledge is socially constructed. Like there are no objective, neutral, universal truths or facts anymore. It's all social position. It comes from your social position. And this was the language that we kept hearing, that it was just so foreign to somebody who really is committed to this idea that, hey, the best way to do no harm is to measure very carefully and to be able to show some kind of empirical data about what's going to work best for all people, because we all share the same biology. Especially around trauma. Trauma, there's a biology of trauma, and that's what how our organization has always operated, is from that biological frame. And so to have these more ontological claims coming in felt really unsafe. It was, they were making claims about identity and about knowledge that felt more like religious and philosophical claims. But then when we tried to say, whoa, it feels like you're trying to have a philosophical conversation, they were offended and said, no, no, this is from our clinical training. Well, it's like, okay, but the clinical trainings have been ideologically captured. That's what's going on. These clinical programs and institutions like the American Psychological Association, they've been ideologically captured, and they've swerved out of their lane, and they're now dealing with philosophical claims where they're no longer able to measure or falsify the things that they are asserting, and yet they're still licensing people. I mean, a great example is affirmative care. Like that became at one point the standard for people being licensed, and yet affirmative care, as we're seeing now, is causing a lot of harm. And Benjamin Boyce has been interviewing a ton of people lately on his podcasts around both clinicians and people who have been impacted by affirmative care. And so that was one of the first issues with our team, actually, where they said, you know we're not being careful enough around non-binary identities, and we need to be making statements that are training around gender identity and all of this. And we were like, whoa, we don't talk about identity at our trainings. We don't tell people things about their identity at our trainings. And so where is this coming from? And again, it was coming from their licensing bodies telling them that they had to do this. So the institutions themselves are ideologically captured. And I think that's where the people coming out of these institutions feel justified in claiming these things as fact, because it's what they've been taught, and the whole framework of knowledge being socially constructed is now just assumed. um, and then when you come back at that with a more traditional, like, no, we're going to go on continuing to measure things and to quantify things and to use data, they will again say that's a white Western patriarchal way of thinking about knowledge. So they just undermine entirely. I think it's, people have called it a moral panic, but I've called it an epistemological panic, because they're undermining people's ways of knowing. And then that leaves you just completely disoriented, because
eh,
you're like, how am I even supposed to establish anything now?
now I'd like to get to how you started pushing back and like how you managed to, like, because again, like, from everything I've seen, it's not, it's a small group of people raising a lot of noise, and then it's other people just either not, putting their head down and just going along, or
Hmm.
kind of like sheepishly agreeing with it. So, like, how did you start Like, what did you do to push back against this stuff?
Right. An interesting critique that I've received many times on Twitter since sharing our organization's story is, why didn't you just fire them right away? And it's like, well, because they were claiming harm. If an employee comes forward to the organization and announces to the entire organization, it's inappropriate and it's unprofessional to do it that way. But if they said, there is harm being done here, it's really not advisable to just fire that person. So it took some untangling of, what these accusations were and was there anything some substantive in them. So that's what we did. My husband is the executive director of the organization. He started meeting one-on-one with the employees who were saying these things and really trying to understand what their claims were. So that was part of it. So that's where I would say, no, actually listening can be a good thing. But where it becomes an impasse is if these people are no longer able to do the job they've been hired to do because of how much they're undermining the framework of knowledge or the entire mission of the organization or the company, because they can no longer function in reality. And so the approach that I took was, we need to define terms because we're not operating within the same realities anymore. And I just began doing research around, if you wanted to define psychological safety, how would you do that? What work has been done in that arena to carefully define what true psychological safety is and what that looks like in organizations. So that was the first paper that I wrote and researched for, was around psychological safety, since we couldn't even have conversations at that point. Every time we had a group conversation around these ideas, afterwards we get more emails and accusations. That conversation harmed me. That conversation was traumatizing. And so it's like, okay, like now we can't even talk because every time we push back against your ideas, we're being accused of doing further harm. So yeah, I think we had a unique position of being the co-founders and having authority within the organization to force people to look at what they were asserting and whether there was any substance in it, and to make them look at what we thought were reasonable, clear definitions of terms that were being we saw misused, or redefined. And then with those redefinitions, making it impossible to function as an organization. So yeah, that was the approach we took, was actually listening to people, leaning in and listening to them about what their accusations were. And when we saw there was no substance really to the accusations, that they were ideological claims, then we started just aggressively defining terms and making people look at those shared definitions of terms.
Like, I've been lately focusing a lot on schools, like K through 12.
Mm-hmm.
And again, when I started reading about this stuff, it was, just to find out where things had gone off the rails,
Mm-hmm.
basically, or what I thought was off the rails. But then when I started seeing it in education, and, colleges and universities are one thing. I mean, you're adults, right? Like, that's where you're supposed to be, at least, anyways. But, around 2010, it got into universities. Into high schools. In some high schools in some states around the around the U.S., like, it wasn't a lot, but it was still. And some of these were like elite, you know, private high schools and things like that. And so these are people who are going to go to Yale and Harvard. And if you look at the timeline of when this stuff started becoming more public, it was around 2013, 2014. It started slipping off the campus, and it was becoming you're becoming more aware of it. People outside the academy were becoming more aware of it. Like, terms like safe spaces and microaggressions were starting to get around.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's in high school in 2010, 2013, 2014, you've got people who've been through a high school system with 3 or 4 years of that. You
Mm-hmm.
get to college, there's plenty of those groups around, so you find more of it. And it's just, so, like, do you have any concerns for, like, the future of things like what you're doing? Because, like, it's fine, fix the AMA right now, fix the APA right now, like, fix the,
Mm-hmm.
fix these organizations right now. But if you don't fix universities, if you don't fix the colleges of education, you don't fix K through 12. And I don't mean just fix K through 12, like, okay, get this stuff out of it. I mean, fix K through 12 so more than 35% of kids graduate reading properly. More than 22% of kids graduate being able to do math properly. Like fix them. Um, but yeah, I mean, like, I'm looking at this. I'm like, you're gonna have a generation of people who don't know how to do anything.
Mm-hmm.
And do you worry about your profession or you, like,
No, yeah, it's definitely concerning, and there's going to be the impact is going to stretch out over the next decade or more in terms of, like you're saying, people are graduating from these institutions fully indoctrinated, and they're going to go into positions of authority over our cultural and governmental institutions, and they're going to continue to educate others in these bad ideas. But yeah, I'm such a believer in objective truth and reality that I just think that things that are not built on the ground will fall. And I just think the more people are courageous in speaking out about the more people understand these ideas and how faulty they are and how damaging they are, people need to be courageous and speak wherever they have a sphere of influence. And that gives me a lot of hope. I do think there will be a lot of collateral damage in the meantime, because there already is collateral damage from where these ideas have been embraced and how they're impacting people's lives and mental health and all the rest. Um, but I do think that ideas that are so fundamentally misaligned with reality and with human nature cannot stand. I mean, it's just you see people more and more and more just like saying like, "Whoa, I was able to go along with this up to a point, and then it's just clearly getting so crazy." Like the assertions that are being made and the way this is making people treat other people, it's just so terrible. So like having their breaking point or whatever.
yeah,
And I honestly think that the difference that will be made is if there were 1,000 people in the entire, I'll speak for my country, United States, who in positions of authority said, no, this is wrong, and I can explain why it's bad, and courageously speak out, within their sphere of influence. That's like all the difference that's needed. But I think there's just so much pressure not to do that, and that I think some people are still operating under this fear of, I don't want to be called a bigot or a racist or a homophobe or a transphobe or whatever. I don't want to be called all the things. So,
mhm.
um, but it really is. I think it's simple, and maybe I'm naive, but all the great myths of all the great stories are all about the lowly person who does the right thing and it turns the tide in the battle. And I really do believe that there's a lot of truth to that.
Yeah. No, I mean, like, I look at all this stuff and I worry about other things. Like I worry about, um, and it was, one of the first things I said when I came back from overseas and started seeing this, I'm like, there's going to be an overcorrection. Like,
Mm.
like this was whatever. It was an overcorrection from things like the Tea Party or whatever, right? Like it was overcorrection from that. And then then Trump got elected. I'm like, okay, maybe that's your overcorrection. There were people, like there was a lot of people saying, oh, well, the excesses of the left are what led us to have Trump, blah, 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 blah. But then they did nothing about it. Then it was 4 years of Orange Man bad. Um, no, but it's true though. Like
Hmm.
the
Yeah.
people who admit it. So like, I'm just looking at all this stuff and I'm like, you let it go on. And, you know, now what are you going to do? Like um,
Yeah, I mean it's a huge big hairy mess, and like you look at the military, you look at our government, you look at all the places that the tentacles of wokeness have made their way into very very powerful institutions, and that is harrowing. It's sobering, and we should take it very seriously. And I'm grateful for the people who are attacking at a high level and pointing out where the civil rights our civil rights movement is being undermined by, now we're embracing discrimination again. Now we're embracing race essentialism again, and stereotyping and scapegoating and all these horrible things. And there's that high level that needs to happen, and laws that need to be written, and policies that need to be addressed. But I really do just, I think the battle is fought at the level of people's communities and families, and that to me is what gives hope. And it kind of goes back to, again, what we were talking about with trauma, is you can look at the big picture of the world and all the trauma that's happening and all the injustices, and you've been there too. You've been in war zones, and I've been there too, and it's overwhelming. But then when you interact with individuals and you see their strength and their courage and their willingness to show up in their family or in their community and tell the truth and be courageous, that is what gives me courage. And it's what has, I mean, it's just remarkable that a thread like mine rippled out across Twitter and then now into the real world of having, people asking me to write articles and appear in podcasts simply because all we did was said, hey, this doesn't line up with reality, and so no. And it's like that little act of courage within our sphere to say, I'm not buying it, I'm calling BS, and this isn't gonna stand, is it, like, people just need to do that. And I hope that people will begin to see the emperor has no clothes with these ideas, and that the accusations don't need to stick. Sure, if there's real racism going on, address it. If there's real bigotry of any kind going on, address it. But if people are calling you these names and you don't actually hold these ideologies, and you're not actually a person who wants to oppress or discriminate against people, do not let those attacks stick, and just speak the truth. Keep it on the ideas and say, hey, like, we don't have to agree. you know I can still dignify you, and you should still dignify me, even though we have different ideas. And we're going to talk about the ideas, and we're going to keep it on the ideas, and you're going to have to substantiate your ideas and prove your ideas. I'm not just going to accept these claims that you're making. People just, I think, need to speak up. I think that's the place that we're at.
Okay. Now, like on the speaking up, because I mean, there's like videos going out about parents and especially like moms speaking up about what's
Mm-hmm.
going on in school and stuff like that. And you'd mentioned at the start as well, like you can't, like the naming of it. Now, oh well, that's not CRT. Like
Mm-hmm.
that, like that. Like I equate this to the science wars. So like when intelligent design was trying to get into schools, and I mean, like I don't know where your stance on that was, but I'm like, okay, that was intelligent design wasn't Christianity,
Mm-hmm.
okay, but it was. I think it was Douglas Murray who used this term. Whatever it was Jesus smuggling. Like it was a way for fundamental like evangelicals or Baptists to get Christianity into K through 12 education. I mean, that's what it was. And so no, the little spreadsheets with professionalism, blah 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 blah, as that's whiteness or whatever. No, that's technically not critical race theory. Like
Mm-hmm.
like, but that's that's like whatever. That's Kimberly Crenshaw smuggling or Ibram Kendi smuggling or whatever. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's all it is. Like that fight. Like it's again what I said with this stuff is like the biggest problem is it it's an impediment to solving real issues. Like
Mm-hmm.
there is a problem with K through 12 education.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's turned into an argument of whether or not the parents are fighting about critical race theory or not in schools. First it was arguing about, okay, let's stop getting our kids to, focus on race or gender or whatever, right? Like you can go down the list. To now it's like, well, okay, well, we're not even like, well, you're calling it critical race theory and it's not.
Mm-hmm.
So you're two levels removed from the problem of kids not being able to read and write.
Mm-hmm.
So like
Right.
it's that with this stuff that, like I said again, it's my biggest issue. Like, well, one of my biggest issues with it is it's just it makes you argue the least important things,
Right.
like whether or not this is critical race theory.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I said, in my mind, it's the same way as intelligent design. It is to critical race theory what intelligent design was to Christianity, and that's all it is. And I mean, like I said, I don't know where your stance on intelligent design was, and I don't particularly really care, but
Uh-huh.
you know, but that's where, like, that's the way I look at it. Like it's you're. and especially with the gender stuff. I mean, when you have like biology departments arguing whether or not there's two sexes, like that, there's a problem there.
Yes. Well, I think the point you're making is a really good point that people need to be able to name the presuppositions with which they come to an argument. And if they can't do that, they're operating from a position of faith that they have not carefully examined and that they are not able to be honest about, because we all operate on faith. I am very firm on this statement because I know that people who are atheists and people who would describe themselves as non-religious say, "Oh no, I don't have faith." And it's like, well, no. Are you able to definitively make statements about the meaning of life or morality or destiny or all these questions that keep everyone awake at night and which we're all trying to do our best to operate within the way that we've chosen to understand and make meaning of the world. And we're all doing that. We're all bringing presuppositions. I mean, atheism is certainly not neutral. There are presuppositions in atheism. So going back to just the smuggling idea, yes, I think it's more important to, rather than to label these ideas like, well, this is CRT and this is bad. It's like, no, look at the presuppositions that are being brought to the students. This idea that certain races have an inherent oppressive quality and certain races have an inherent oppressed quality is race essentialism, is attaching moral values to people's skin colors. It's just disgusting. It's going backwards. And so to address, to make them make the argument for why what they want to do is good, rather than say critical race theory is bad, and then there's this slipperiness that happens that where they say, well, I'm not doing critical race theory. You don't obviously understand it. Critical race theory is a legal theory. Why would we be teaching a legal theory to kindergartners? It's like, no, you know what you're doing. You're aware of what these ideas say. And so make them stay on the ideas. But that assumes that they've actually examined the presuppositions in their theory, which oftentimes they have not. They have assumed them to be fact, but the facts are based on assertions that were never themselves, verified and can't be verified or falsified because they are not in the realm of the empirical. They're not scientific. They're not quantifiable claims. So they're operating from a almost religious frame, but proclaiming it as a sort of science and saying, well, we know these things. And so now the kids need to know these things. So that's where I think the approach, and I've seen it lately from some people who, have really put in a lot of work around addressing critical race theory in the schools, like Chris Rufo, where they're saying, if you want to be effective at fighting this fight, you need to know what the ideas are within the theory so that you can engage the ideas. Because just engaging the title of the theory, yes, they're going to be slippery and they're going to figure out a way to say, you don't know what you're talking about. You didn't define it correctly. Versus like, well, no, but I see the ideas that are manifesting and being taught. And I don't agree with these ideas on principle for these reasons. I think that's the right approach.
Yeah, yeah, like I said, the naming thing was it's just ridiculous. But okay, I don't want to keep you too much longer, but one of the things I want to talk about was this: is that like with the kids, okay, and I mean we can take this going up, but now this experiment is being run, like this, like the anti-racism stuff. Where so when I say it's being run, like I said, this got into high schools in like what 2013, but in 2015, um, and I mean there were other schools where they had this, but like this was one where you had the case study, you had it, we know what happened. So in 2015, this academy in New York City, where I think they pay like the number like 47,000 sticks in my head per year to send their kids there.
Hmm.
So the academy is from K through 8, but they were doing this to kids from 3rd grade to 8th grade. So they sent letters home to the parents asking the parents for the race of their child, because there was also a lot of mixed race kids, and how the child wants to identify or how they want to identify their child. And then they split 45 minutes a week. They split the kids up into racial groups. They told except for the white kids, they told all the other kids all the good things that their races had done. The white kids, they were they told them they were oppressors and they'd oppressed everyone, and they'd go, oh, you colonized the world, you did this, blah 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 blah, and all, like, and all the other kids, they told them that they were oppressed, and it was the white kids that oppressed them, or the white people that oppressed them. And all the kids started going online looking the great good things about my race, things like that. I mean, within a couple of months, these kids were spouting off nationalistic, like stuff. Like the white kids were sounding like white supremacists. It was, I mean, like I said, this is like starting in the third grade, for Christ's sakes.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay. And this was kind of where I was going with before, where I completely like derailed myself. Like that overcorrection. Now,
Mm-hmm.
I know there's a whole big thing now. Okay, James Lindsay's calling, saying there's going to be a white genocide or whatever, but like I don't even want to get into that. But I'm like, forget that for a second. But you know, if that happened to third graders, and like you're going up to the eighth grade, that school is still like, it was still in the news like last year and the year before for like a lot of racial tensions. Like I think like two of the upper up, like higher ups in the administration quit or got fired or were forced to
Mm-hmm.
resign. Like it's a lot of stuff's been going on there. Like, don't there's going to be a reaction to
Mm-hmm.
getting white people to focus on a racial identity, and there's been a few articles coming out about how there's becoming an uptick in people focusing on a white racial identity, like white people. And there was I think it was the American Psychology Association or whatever. They put out an article about how there was a growth in racial identity in Hispanic and Black kids, and then they were starting to notice that starting to grow in white kids. Like,
Mm.
you don't want that. Like, I'm not talking
No.
about a white genocide or any of that bullshit, but I'm just, you don't want like a majority white country to feel aggrieved, because I mean, it's easy to take like a paper that just came, that paper that came out, like the parasitic whiteness or whatever, that one that just came out
Yeah.
recently.
Mm-hmm.
It's easy for someone like Richard Spencer to take that and rile people up, like
Mm-hmm.
especially when the economy's in the shitter and
Mm-hmm.
it's, people are hurting and things are
Mm-hmm.
going on. I'm like, okay, you've got an easy way to rile people up now,
Mm-hmm.
and forget about anything else. Like elite, like, yo, fine. It might not be everyone trying to commit a genocide against white people, but if you get a critical mass of crazies, and if you have kids coming out of school like learning this kind of shit, like what do you think's going to happen? In
Right.
you know,
Well, and that's a great point, because anyone who's studied history knows that every time we've attached moral significance to race, genocide usually is the result. And I don't claim that, and James Lindsay did not claim that a white genocide was coming, even though that was what his words were construed to be. He said accurately that the language that was being used in papers like this and in the recent lecture at Yale by the psychoanalyst, were genocidal language, the seeds of genocide in that language. And he clarified, I don't think a white genocide is likely to happen.
yeah,
But that is language that in history, if you're a student of history, it will create the kind of violent tribalism where people become deranged around these tribalistic identities, and they truly see the other as inhuman at that point. And when you start calling people parasites, and you start saying there's no permanent cure, was the language
mm-hmm.
used in that paper published in the American Psychiatric Association journal. um, that is really alarming. That is really incredible that a professional who's a dean at a institute of higher education felt that was an appropriate thing to publish in a journal. Was this abstract that says that whiteness is this parasitic condition for which there is no cure. And absolutely, like, we need to call it what it is, and it's not alarmist to say, like, hey, I've seen this happen in the past. I've seen very similar language used in the past, And you're right, it will create a pendulum swinging far in the other direction. And this is a white majority country. It has nothing to do with whiteness. Whoever is in the majority in a place where racial tribalism becomes, race essentialism becomes the norm, the majority is gonna,
Yeah,
have the advantage. And so absolutely, it's in everyone's worst interest to attach moral qualities to race. And this is just absolutely disgusting and irresponsible that people are saying that they're doing this in the name of justice. It's just total ignorance. And um, and history bears out that when this begins to happen, it will only lead to violence. I'm not saying that, and no one has claimed that a white genocide is imminent, but it cannot lead in a good direction.
yeah, and I mean, like, whatever. I guess it's just one last thing on this. It's okay. So the recent attack, like anti-Semitic attacks, so that
Hmm.
happened. Now, yeah, the proximal cause was what was going on between Israel and Hamas, right? That's the proximal cause of that. But in 2015, when you had the same, like I think it was 2015, maybe 16, similar thing happened with Israel and Gaza. Went on for a couple of days, rockets going back and forth, and you didn't have the same level of attacks. Now, I, I mean, you really saw it last year, but even before that, for a couple of years, where Jews are white, and then I mean the increase in attacks on Asians because Asians have taken on whiteness. I mean, they're like stupid things like yellow privilege, and there was this one thing. I don't know if it was in the Washington Post or the New York Times, but multiracial whiteness. Um, so I mean, yeah, yeah, yeah. So you equate whiteness with evil.
Hmm.
You know, like last year during the riots, some of the BLM riots, synagogues got attacked and vandalized, and it said like "Free Palestine" and stuff like that. And you had people like Nicole Hannah Jones saying, "Well, property is whiteness," so they're like
Hmm.
equating Jews. So it doesn't matter.
Hmm.
So yeah, more Jews are getting attacked because you've got a group now saying like they're not being there's a whole segment now that's saying, okay, well, they're white, so it's kind of okay. Because you've demonized them. You've made being white, you've made whiteness evil, and you've ascribed whiteness to these people. And I mean, like, like I said, it's going on with South and East Asians, you know, like people like John McWhorter and stuff like that. Like just white adjacent, all this other bullshit, like I said, multiracial whiteness. Like, so you've got that as well. Where now, okay, fine, we're not going to attack the majority, but here's some other people who are, you know, because some of these people as well are like, okay, well, I'm poor, I'm downtrodden, I'm whatever, like for whatever reason, right? Like, and that okay, but so these people are taken from me as well, so I can attack them. Like it's I mean, hell, you've like sorry, I was rambling a little bit, but you still got like articles coming out about how the attack, black people attacking Asians, that's still due to white supremacy. There was an
Right.
article in the New York Times, I think it was in 2019. It
Hmm.
was two South Asian kids beating up two South Asian boys beating up four black girls,
Hmm.
and they said it was due to whiteness. They
Hmm.
still ascribed it to whiteness. So it's like,
Hmm.
you know,
Yeah, when you externalize guilt and responsibility, that's what can happen. So I think a big key to the solution is returning the locus of responsibility and the locus of guilt to the individual. And that's also empowering because it says your actions determine your outcomes, not your identities. So you making the choice to treat others the way you want to be treated, to do what you need to do today, to be responsible for yourself and others around you, to be generous, to be caring, to be a good listener. Like all of those things are within your power to do. And yes, there are factors that have meant that some people are starting with less than others, but that has been the case throughout human history. That we're not all born into the same set of conditions of privileges, if you want to call them that, and we don't all end up with the same privileges. And it is just ludicrous and hilarious to say that equality of outcomes should be a goal or is even possible, given all of our different um, makeup of the intellectual capacity that we have, the personalities that we have, even the desires that we have are not the same. So just returning that, you know, idea of the locus of responsibility and of guilt being within the individual, and that is that, competence. Jordan Peterson always is talking about competence. Competence is the fairest system that we can get. It's the closest to fairness that we can get. Is do the best that you can to improve your character, to grow virtue in yourself, to be courageous, to understand first of all what you believe to be true, and then to speak it courageously, to listen to others well, to treat others the way you want to be treated. I mean, it's all kindergarten stuff. It's all so simple, but it's like it's the truth.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's both sobering that we've gotten so far from that, but it's also hopeful that I think one on one, when they're, unless someone is truly psychotic and has serious mental health um, issues going on, you can engage with almost any human being on these terms, and there's an intuitive understanding that yes, that is right. That would be good. And I know some people are so ideologically indoctrinated at this point that it can take some time to get there. But again, I live in a place where these ideologies reign supreme, and I still am encouraged by being able to have conversations with people that expose the folly of these ideas, and where is that going to take us, and is this really what we want. So again, I just think that people in their spheres of influence, people in their families and communities, we all now have family members who have gone woke, or coworkers who are woke, or whatever. We need to just be brave to push back, and part of that is being able to do that is taking the time to understand the ideas so that you can push back in principle on the idea. So it's not just saying, "Oh, I don't like that," because then they're going to attack you and say, "Well, you don't like it because you're fragile about your masculinity or your whiteness or whatever." And being able to make an articulate defense for why, in principle, these ideas will not solve the problems of injustice, and that there are other ideas that will better solve the problems of injustice is what people need to invest in doing, being able to articulate those things.
Well, great. That's a good place to end on. So thanks a lot. If you want to let people know where they can get a hold of you.
Sure, yeah. I have a Twitter account. The handle is Graces for You. Um, yeah, that's pretty much my online presence.
Right. Yeah. Keep yourself a little bit sane. Stay off the other ones. Anyways, thank you very much again. It was great talking to you.
Yeah, likewise.
Right. And thanks everyone for listening.